The payments had been going on for 3 years before Wyatt Earp rode into Harlan's Crossing, which was long enough for the payments to have acquired the specific legitimacy that time confers on arrangements that nobody challenges, the legitimacy not of law or justice but of precedent, of the simple fact that a thing has been happening for long enough that the people involved in it have stopped asking whether it should be happening and have redirected their energy toward the more practical question of how to make it continue to happen with the minimum of disruption to everything else they were trying to do. And in Harlan's Crossing, Kansas, in the autumn of 1880, this meant that every merchant and every rancher and every freighting operator within a 30-mile radius had a line in their accounts that did not appear in any ledger they would willingly show to a stranger, a line that represented the monthly sum paid to a man named Harlan Burke for the continued privilege of conducting business in the territory that Harlan Burke had, over the course of 3 years, come to consider his. Harlan Burke had not inherited the territory and had not purchased it and had not been granted it by any authority with the standing to grant territories, but had acquired it through the specific mechanism by which territories were acquired in that era and that geography by men of his particular disposition and operational capability, which was through the sustained application of enough force and the credible threat of more force to the population of the territory until the population arrived. Through the accumulated weight of individual decisions, each of which was entirely rational in isolation, at the collective conclusion that paying was less costly than not paying, and this conclusion, once arrived at collectively, had the self-reinforcing quality of all collective conclusions, because each individual's continued payment made every other individual's payment more rational, since defection from a collective arrangement that everyone else was maintaining carried costs that defection from a failing arrangement did not, and so the payments continued and the arrangement maintained itself, and Harlan Burke collected his income with the regularity of a landlord collecting rent from tenants who had never signed a lease but had somehow come to understand that the lease was a fact regardless. The man who ran the general store on the main street of Harlan's Crossing was named Samuel Pratt, and he had been making his payments for 31 months, and he had arrived at a point in his relationship with the payments that was common among the merchants of Harlan's Crossing, which was the point past which resentment had exhausted itself and had been replaced by something more durable and more dangerous, which was a settled, quiet, completely hopeless conviction that the arrangement was simply the condition of life in Harlan's Crossing, and that the appropriate response to it was the same as the appropriate response to weather, which was to account for it in your planning and not waste energy wishing it were otherwise. And this conviction had settled so deeply into Samuel Pratt's understanding of his situation that when Wyatt Earp walked into his store on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1880 and bought a box of matches and a pound of coffee and asked, in the casual manner of a man making conversation, whether the town had a marshal, Pratt had answered the question with the specific flatness of a man for whom the question had no meaningful answer, which was to say he had said yes, there was a marshal, a man named Dobbs, and had said nothing else, and had taken the money for the matches and the coffee and made change with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to conduct every transaction with the minimum of additional engagement because additional engagement in Harlan's Crossing had a way of producing complications. Wyatt had taken his matches and his coffee and his change and had looked at Samuel Pratt for a moment in the way he looked at things he was in the process of understanding, and then he had left, and Pratt had watched him go and had felt something that he did not immediately recognize because he had not felt it in some time, which was the specific quality of attention that a situation receives when someone is looking at it from outside rather than from inside, when someone who has not been living with the arrangement long enough to have stopped seeing it as an arrangement is encountering it for the first time and seeing it for what it actually is rather than for what prolonged proximity had made it appear to be, and the feeling of being seen in that way, of having the arrangement seen in that way, produced in Samuel Pratt a reaction that was complicated and that he did not fully process until later that evening when he was closing the store, which was a reaction composed in roughly equal parts of shame and hope, the shame being the shame of having normalized something that the outside gaze revealed as not normal, and the hope being the hope of a man who has been told for a long time that there is no other way and has just seen in a stranger's eyes the suggestion that this might not be accurate. Wyatt spent 4 days in Harlan's Crossing before his first direct encounter with Harlan Burke's operation, for days during which he assembled the picture of the arrangement with the methodical thoroughness he brought to all such pictures, moving through the town and its surrounding territory with the specific quality of unhurried attention that made him, in towns like this one, simultaneously invisible and omnipresent, present in the places where things happened without being present in the way that caused the things that happened to change in his presence, and the picture that 4 days produced was one he had seen in variations before but that had in Harlan's Crossing a specific characteristic that distinguished it from the standard version, which was the particular depth of the resignation that had settled over the town, the degree to which the population had not merely accepted the arrangement but had internalized it as a feature of reality rather than a feature of the situation, and this depth of internalization was significant because it meant that whatever Wyatt was going to do here would need to address not only the operational mechanism of the arrangement, which was Harlan Burke and the 8 men who worked for him, but the psychological infrastructure that the arrangement had built inside the people it had been operating on for 3 years. Because a town could be freed from an arrangement and still remain imprisoned by the habit of thinking that the arrangement had installed in it, and a town in that condition was not actually free regardless of what had happened to the men who had been collecting from it. Harlan Burke's first awareness of Wyatt Earp as a specific problem rather than a generic stranger came on the 5th day, through a report from one of the men whose function in Burke's operation was to monitor the movement of people and information through the territory, a man named Ike Stassen who had the particular talent for peripheral observation that the function required. And what Stassen reported was not that Wyatt had done anything specific or said anything specific or made any visible move that could be characterized as a threat or a challenge, but simply that Wyatt had been in a series of places over 4 days in a specific sequence that Stassen, whose professional competence extended to pattern recognition of this kind, assessed as reconnaissance rather than tourism, the sequence of a man mapping a situation rather than passing through one. And Burke had listened to this assessment and had run the standard calculation that the assessment of new arrivals always required him to run, which was a calculation about the ratio of the new arrival's apparent capability to the cost of addressing that capability preemptively versus reactively, and the calculation had produced a result in the direction of preemptive address, which was the direction it usually produced when the new arrival in question was a man who moved through a territory the way Stassen described Wyatt moving through it, because men who moved through territories that way were men who had come for a reason, and whose reason was not compatible with the continued undisturbed operation of arrangements like Burke's. The preemptive address took the form of a visit to the room Wyatt was renting above the feed store at the east end of Harlan's Crossing's Main Street, a visit conducted by Stassen and 2 other men on the evening of the 5th day, a visit whose purpose was the standard purpose of such visits, which was to communicate to the new arrival that the territory had an existing structure and that the new arrival's options were to accommodate the structure or to leave, and the visit produced the result that visits of this kind produced when they were paid to Wyatt Earp, which was a result that was not the result the visitors had anticipated and that the visitors found difficult to describe afterward, not because anything dramatic had happened, because nothing dramatic had happened in any conventional sense, but because the conversation had proceeded along the expected lines for approximately 45 seconds and had then gone somewhere that the expected lines did not include, and the somewhere it had gone was a place that all 3 visitors left the room with a changed understanding of, the specific understanding that they were dealing with someone whose relationship to the structure they were describing was not the relationship of a man who needed to be told what the structure was and what it cost to resist it, but the relationship of a man who had already assessed the structure and had arrived at a judgment about it and was not going to revise that judgment based on the communication being delivered. Ike Stassen reported this back to Harlan Burke. Burke thought about it. Then he thought about it some more. The thinking produced an assessment that was unusual for Burke in the sense that it was an assessment that acknowledged the possibility that the standard approach to new arrivals who did not accommodate the structure was not the appropriate approach in this specific instance, which was an acknowledgement that Burke's confidence in his own methods did not usually produce. And the reason it produced it here was the specific quality of Stassen's report, the specific way that Stassen had described the conversation and the man who had conducted it, which was not with the language of fear, because Stassen was not a man who used that language, but with the language of professional recognition, the language of a man who had encountered something in his professional capacity that did not fit the category he had prepared for it and was reporting this accurately because accurate reporting was the basis of his value to Burke's operation, and what the accurate reporting conveyed was that the man in the room above the feed store was not going to be moved by what had moved every other man Burke's operation had encountered, and that the appropriate response to this fact was not immediately obvious. Burke's decision, reached after 2 days of the uncharacteristic uncertainty that Stassen's report had produced, was to address the situation himself, directly, which was the same decision that Vincent Crowe had made in Redemption Creek under similar circumstances and for similar reasons, and which carried the same embedded communication, the communication of a principal rather than an agent, of a man who considered the situation significant enough to warrant his own attention, and Burke made the decision with the specific confidence of a man who had built something substantial and who believed that the substantiality of what he had built was itself an argument, that the visible weight of the arrangement, the 3 years of successful operation, the 30-mile territory, the 8 men, the network of complicit merchants and intimidated ranchers and quietly accommodating local officials, all of it together constituted a case that was difficult to argue with, that the sheer accumulated fact of the arrangement was the strongest communication he could make to any new arrival about the cost of attempting to disrupt it. He met Wyatt at the feed store on the morning of the 7th day, and the meeting was conducted with the specific courtesy that men of Burke's type deployed in direct conversations with men they were in the process of assessing, a courtesy that was precise and controlled and that communicated, through its precision and control, that the person extending it was doing so from a position of assured dominance rather than genuine goodwill, and Burke presented his case with the clarity of a man who had made it many times before to many different people and had refined it through repetition into its most efficient form, and the case was this. The territory had a structure, the structure had costs, the costs were less than the cost of disruption, the people who had understood this were prospering within the arrangement, the people who had not understood it had in various ways come to understand it eventually, and the only remaining question was how long it would take Wyatt Earp to arrive at the same understanding that everyone else in the territory had arrived at, and whether the time required for that arrival would be spent productively or not. Wyatt listened to the case in its entirety. Then he told Burke what he thought of it. Not in the manner of a man delivering a counter-argument, because the case was not the kind of thing that benefited from counter-argument, was not a position in a debate but a statement of power, and statements of power were not addressed by arguments but by other statements of power, and what Wyatt said was a statement of power in the specific register that statements of power took when they came from Wyatt Earp, which was the register of a man who had assessed the situation and found it insufficient to change what he was going to do, who had heard the description of the costs and had weighed them against other costs and found the balance and was communicating the result of that weighing in a voice that did not require elevation or emphasis to carry the weight it was carrying. And what Burke heard in that voice was the same thing that Crowe had heard and Drummond had heard and everyone else who had had this conversation with Wyatt had heard, which was the specific quality of a man who was not performing conviction but was in actual possession of it, and the possession of it was complete enough that it did not require the performance. Burke left the feed store. He was not accustomed to leaving conversations like this one in the direction of departure rather than conclusion, and the unfamiliarity of the experience occupied a significant portion of his subsequent thinking that was complicated by the fact that the departure had not been produced by any threat or any demonstration of force but simply by the quality of what Wyatt had said and how he had said it, which was not something Burke's existing framework for these situations had. Category 4, because his framework categorized responses to his case as accommodation, negotiation, or resistance, and what he had encountered was none of these things but something that preceded all of them, a response that did not engage with the terms of the case at all but simply registered that the case had been made and was insufficient. The debt that the town of Harlan's Crossing owed, the debt that was not the monthly payment to Burke and was not recorded in any ledger and had no fixed amount and no established payment schedule, was not a debt that Wyatt had come to collect in any conscious or deliberate sense, was not something he had ridden into Harlan's Crossing knowing about or planning to address, had not in fact been framed as a debt by anyone in the town, because the concept of debt implied a creditor, and the people of Harlan's Crossing had stopped believing in the existence of creditors of that particular kind, had stopped believing that the 3 years of payment had generated any claim on the part of the people paying or any obligation on the part of the universe to provide them with something in return for what they had given up, and this disbelief was the deepest damage that Burke's arrangement had done to the town, deeper than the economic extraction, deeper than the individual acts of violence that had established and maintained the arrangement, which was the damage of having persuaded an entire community that the relationship between what you gave and what you could expect in return was not a relationship that applied to them. What Wyatt was going to collect was not money and was not revenge and was not the specific satisfaction of having dismantled something that needed dismantling, though all of these things would be involved in one degree or another in what followed, but was the thing that Burke's arrangement had taken from Harlan's Crossing that had no line in any ledger and no price that could be set for it, which was the town's understanding of its own situation as something that could be different from what it currently was, its understanding of itself as a place that had choices rather than a place that had conditions, and the collection of this debt was the kind of collection that took place not in a single dramatic confrontation but in the accumulated weight of daily presence, of being consistently, visibly, unalterably there in a way that communicated to everyone who observed it that what they had been told was the only possible configuration of their circumstances was not the only possible configuration. Samuel Pratt felt it first, because Pratt was the person in Harlan's Crossing who had the most recently experienced the sensation of having his situation seen from the outside, and who had therefore retained, unlike most of the other merchants, a residual capacity to feel the difference between the inside view and the outside one, and what he felt was a gradual shift in the specific weight of the arrangement, a reduction in the density of its inevitability, the sense that the thing he had been accounting for in his planning the way he accounted for weather was beginning to seem, for the first time in 31 months, like a human construction rather than a natural phenomenon, and that human constructions, unlike weather, could be changed. He was not the only one. The rancher named Fowler who operated the largest cattle operation within Burke's territory felt it when Wyatt rode out to his property on the 8th day and spent 2 hours with him in his kitchen going over the specifics of what the monthly payment had cost him over 3 years, not to build a legal case, though the specifics would eventually be part of one, but because the act of going over the specifics with someone who was listening to them without the accumulated resignation that Fowler brought to his own account of them produced in Fowler the experience of hearing his own situation accurately for the first time in a long time, and this experience was, for Fowler, something close to what Pratt had felt in the store, the experience of being seen, of having the arrangement seen, of encountering in another person's attention the information that what had been presented to him as the only possible world was in fact a specific construction with specific architects and specific foundations that could, under the right circumstances, be addressed. The right circumstances were assembled over the following 2 weeks with the same methodical patience that Wyatt brought to everything, the evidence gathered, the accounts compared, the specific mechanisms of Burke's operation documented with the assistance of people who had been living inside it for long enough to know its structure from the inside out. And when the documentation was sufficient, Wyatt rode to the county seat and laid what he had in front of the county sheriff, a man named Aldridge, who had been aware of Burke's operation for longer than he was comfortable admitting and who had been operating within the category of things he told himself he could not address, and who, when confronted with the documentation that Wyatt laid in front of him and the specific quality of attention with which Wyatt waited for him to respond to it, found that the category had been considerably reduced in size. Harlan Burke was arrested on the 15th day after Wyatt's arrival in Harlan's Crossing. The arrest was conducted by the county sheriff with Wyatt present, and it was not dramatic in the manner of the events that would later be recounted in the stories that circulated about it, because the most significant confrontations of Wyatt Earp's career were rarely dramatic in the expected manner at the time they occurred and became dramatic only in the retelling, when the selection and compression that the retelling required transformed the accumulated weight of many small actions into the sharp clarity of a single decisive one. And what actually happened on the 15th day was that Harlan Burke, when confronted with the sheriff and with Wyatt and with the documentation, made the calculation that his situation required and found, as the calculation always found when it was made accurately in the presence of Wyatt Earp, that the available options had been reduced to one. He went to the county jail. The 8 men who had formed the operational capability of his arrangement dispersed over the following week into the categories that the operational members of such arrangements dispersed into when the arrangement was no longer operational, some leaving the territory, some accommodating themselves to the changed circumstances by ceasing to be who they had been professionally, some requiring the more specific attention that Wyatt provided to the ones who did not accommodate voluntarily, and within 2 weeks of Burke's arrest the arrangement was no longer an arrangement but a memory, and a memory of a specific type, the type that leaves a residue not of nostalgia but of the specific emotion that follows the ending of something that should have ended earlier, which was a combination of relief and anger and the particular shame that came from understanding, in retrospect, what had been given up in exchange for the monthly peace that the payments had purchased. Samuel Pratt closed his store on the evening of the day the last of Burke's men left the territory and sat at the desk in his back office where he kept his accounts and opened the ledger to the page where the payments were recorded, the page with no heading, the page whose existence he had never mentioned to anyone including his wife, and he looked at the numbers for a long time, adding them in his head for the first time, arriving at a total that he had never previously allowed himself to calculate because the calculation would have required him to fully confront the cost of the arrangement in a way that living inside it had made it possible to avoid, and the total, when he arrived at it, was considerable, and he sat with it for a while, and then he closed the ledger and put it in the drawer and locked the drawer, and the thing that he felt, sitting at that desk in his closed store on the evening that the last of Burke's men had left, was not precisely what he would have predicted he would feel, was not the clean uncomplicated relief he had imagined on the occasions when he had allowed himself to imagine this moment, but was something more complex and more durable, something that had in it the relief but also the anger and also something else that took him several days to identify, which was the specific emotion of a man who has been reminded that he is capable of more than he has been settling for, that the accounting he has been making of himself has been based on a reduced version of his own capacity that the arrangement had installed, and that the reduced version was not the true version, and that knowing this was not comfortable but was necessary, and that the necessity of it was itself a form of the debt being repaid. Wyatt left Harlan's Crossing on the 18th day. He left the way he always left, without ceremony, at the pace that was neither fast nor slow but was simply his pace, and the town he left behind was not a repaired town or a healed town or a town that had resolved all the damage that 3 years of the arrangement had done to it, because towns are not repaired quickly and the damage that prolonged arrangements of this kind do to the people who live inside them is not the kind of damage that resolves itself in 2 weeks, but it was a town that had recovered the knowledge that it was not a finished thing, that the configuration it had been living in was not the only configuration available to it, and this knowledge was what Wyatt had come to collect, was the debt he had ridden in to settle, was the thing that no amount of monthly payment could have purchased and that Burke's arrangement had been taking from the town every month along with the money, silently, without a line in any ledger, the most valuable thing the arrangement extracted and the last to be returned. The ledger in Samuel Pratt's drawer stayed locked for a long time. Then one morning he unlocked it and took it out and added a final entry on the page with no heading, an entry that was not a payment but a notation, a single line in his careful merchant's handwriting that recorded the date and the amount of the total he had calculated on the evening the last of Burke's men left, not as a debt to be collected from anyone, because there was no one left to collect it from, but as a record, the specific kind of record that a man keeps when he wants to make sure he does not forget what something cost, when the remembering of the cost is the only form of accounting available and also the only form of accounting that matters. And then he closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer and went out to open his store, and the morning light on the main street of Harlan's Crossing was the same light it had always been, flat and hard and indifferent to everything that happened under it, and Samuel Pratt walked through it toward his store with the specific quality of a man who is carrying the full weight of what he knows and has decided that this is preferable to the alternative, and the alternative was the weight he had been carrying for 31 months, which was the weight of pretending that he did not know, and that weight, it turned out, had been considerably heavier. There is a kind of debt that accumulates in silence, that has no creditor and no payment schedule and no line in any ledger, that is taken not in money but in something more fundamental and more difficult to name, which is the understanding a community has of its own possibilities, its sense of what it is capable of and what it can expect and what the relationship is between what it puts into the world and what it can reasonably hope to get back, and this kind of debt is the kind that is hardest to collect because the collection requires not a transfer of money or a change in personnel or even the removal of the specific mechanism that has been extracting the payment, but a change in the understanding itself, a restoration of the capacity to see one situation as a situation rather than a condition, as something produced by human choices rather than something given by the nature of things. And this restoration is the kind of thing that cannot be accomplished by an outside agent acting on a community but only by a community acting on itself in response to something that an outside agent has made available to it, and what Wyatt Earp made available to Harlan's Crossing was not the removal of Harlan Burke, though the removal of Harlan Burke was part of it, but the prior thing, the thing that made the removal possible, which was the demonstration, conducted through 18 days of unhurried methodical presence, that the arrangement was not the only possible configuration of the territory, that the people who had been living inside it had been living inside a human construction and not a natural law, and that human constructions, unlike natural laws, could be addressed. Samuel Pratt's ledger entry was the measure of what this demonstration had cost the town, and it was a considerable measure, and it was also, in the specific way that measures of real costs are also measures of real value, an account of what the demonstration had been worth, which was everything it had cost and more, because what had been returned to Harlan's Crossing was worth more than what had been taken from it, was worth more precisely because what had been taken could be quantified and what had been returned could not, and the ledger that could hold the number on the left side of that accounting did not exist and could not be constructed, because the right side of it was the town's understanding of itself as something that could be different from what it had been. And that understanding had no denomination and no market price and was not the kind of thing that appeared in the records that men kept of what they owned and what they owed, but was the kind of thing that appeared instead in the way a man walked out to open his store on a morning after the last of the men who had been taking from him had left the territory, the specific quality of that walk, the weight it carried and the weight it had put down, the difference between those two weights being the only accounting that mattered and the only one that was in any sense complete. Wyatt Earp did not keep accounts of this kind and did not think in these terms and would not have found the framework useful even if it had been presented to him, because his relationship to the towns he moved through was not a relationship of accounting but a relationship of action, and the action was complete when the situation no longer required what he had been providing. And the situation in Harlan's Crossing no longer required what he had been providing on the 18th day, and so he left, at his pace, in his direction, carrying forward the accumulated weight of everything that had produced him and everything he had done and every town he had moved through in this way, and the weight was considerable and he carried it the way he carried everything, without complaint and without ceremony and without any public account of what it cost, because the cost was not the point, had never been the point, and the point was the next town, which was always the next town, which was always some version of the same town, which was always waiting for him at the end of the distance ahead, needing what he had and unable to produce it from its own resources and unable to fully understand, until he arrived and did what he did and left again, that what it had needed was not what it had thought it needed, was not the removal of a specific man or the resolution of a specific situation, but the prior thing, the thing that the removal and the resolution were consequences of, which was the demonstration that the situation was addressable, that the world was not organized permanently in the way that it had appeared to be organized, and that this demonstration was available, for the cost of 18 days and the particular qualities that made those days what they were, to any town that needed it, anywhere in the territory, at the end of whatever distance lay between where Wyatt Earp currently was and where the next version of the same town was waiting. Harlan Burke had collected from Harlan's Crossing for 3 years because he understood one thing very well and did not understand another thing at all, and the thing he understood very well was the mathematics of collective resignation, the way that individual rational decisions accumulated into collective irrationality, the way that a community could be held in an arrangement not by the continuous application of force but by the accumulated weight of everyone's belief that everyone else was going to continue to accept the arrangement, because as long as that belief held the arrangement was self-maintaining and required only the occasional demonstration of consequences for defection to keep the belief in place, and he had been right about this, had been right about it for 3 years, had built on the basis of being right about it something that functioned efficiently and produced consistent returns and had survived every challenge that the standard population of challengers had presented to it. And the reason it had survived was that the standard population of challengers had challenged it on its own terms, had attempted to organize resistance through the mechanisms that the arrangement had already accounted for and neutralized, had tried to do collectively what the arrangement's genius was precisely the prevention of, and had failed in the specific ways that collective action in the face of collective resignation always fails, which is to say had failed to overcome the individual rationality of continued payment with any individual rationality of resistance that was sufficiently compelling to produce the critical mass of defection that the arrangement required to collapse. What he had not understood was that the arrangement had a vulnerability that was not visible from inside the arrangement, that was in fact invisible from any position that was defined by the arrangement's own terms, and the vulnerability was this. The arrangement required, for its continued operation, not just the payment but the belief, not just the money but the worldview that produced the money, the settled conviction in every individual payer that paying was not a choice they were making but a condition they were managing, and this worldview was not infinitely robust, was not a permanent feature of the people who held it but a structure that had been built into them by 3 years of the specific experience that builds such structures, and that could therefore, in principle, be dismantled by the specific experience that dismantles them, which was the experience of having the structure seen from outside, seen accurately, seen without the accumulated weight of the experience that had installed it, seen by someone whose relationship to the arrangement was not the relationship of a person who lived inside it but the relationship of a person who was looking at it and finding it insufficient, and this experience, repeated across enough of the individuals whose collective belief maintained the arrangement, was the thing that the arrangement could not survive, because the arrangement was not maintained by force but by belief, and the belief was not maintained by force but by the absence of the specific experience that dissolved it. And Wyatt Earp's presence in Harlan's Crossing for 18 days was precisely and exclusively the provision of that experience, delivered without announcement and without drama and without any of the conventional apparatus of liberation, simply through the quality of attention he brought to a situation that had not been attended to in that way for 3 years, and the delivery of that experience to enough people in enough conversations and enough observations over enough days was the collection of the debt, was the only collection of the debt that was possible, was the most complete collection of the debt that had ever been made in Harlan's Crossing or in any of the towns like it, and it was conducted, as all of Wyatt Earp's most significant work was conducted, in a register so quiet that the people it was done for did not fully understand what had been done until the doing was complete and the man who had done it was already gone.